Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. You may remember that some time ago now we started hearing evidence from Mr. Sounes, one of the architects from Studio E. We had to break off his evidence at that time, but I'm glad to say that we're going to be able to resume it this morning. So could I ask Mr. Sounes to come to the witness box, please? Yes, do sit down, Mr. Sounes. Now, before we begin, I think it's right that I should remind you publicly that you took an oath to tell the truth when you started giving your evidence, and that continues to be the case. You are still on oath, all right? Yes. And the other thing I think I should mention, because a lot of time has passed since you were last here, now you're in the course of giving your evidence, it's very important that you don't discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone else. Right, and that includes Mr. Cushell, who I see is back sitting in the room. So yes. Don't talk to anyone else, either in person or by phone or anything else about your evidence until you've completely finished. All right?
Understood.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, good morning, Mr. Sounes. So when we broke off last time, which was on the 11th of March 2020, we'd started looking at the topic of insulation. The insulation that sat behind the rain screen panels. And we were partway through a detailed consideration of the documents and the chronology and how Celotex FR 5000 came to be in the employer's requirements in the NBS specification. Do you remember?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I am going to just pick up where we left off on that topic. And I want to start by looking at an email which is at SEA 404737 at page 2. Yes, so just to orientate yourself within this is an email from Mr. Smith, is it Matt Smith of
yes.
Max Fordham to you on the 18th of June 2012. And the subject is Grenfell Tower wall build-up. And he says, "Afternoon, Bruce. Do you have an idea on the likely wall cladding build-up yet? What U value are you targeting?" And then he talks about some early indications from the acoustics survey. So he's asking you, what U value are you targeting? Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, do you agree that it was for Studio E as the lead consultant and the lead designer, Studio E would have all the necessary information to make an assessment as to what the target U value would be?
I knew that the U value target would be governed by Part L.
Yeah.
That I knew.
Yes.
I knew I could look it up.
Yeah.
That's answered your question, I think. The reality is, in most of my experience, and particularly with Max Fordham, which goes back a long way, we tended to look to them to propose a U value.
I see. Yeah. Do you agree in this email he seems to be asking you what U value you are targeting?
Yes.
Yeah. And is that how you understood it at the time, that he was looking to you to give some indication from your perspective as what you were targeting?
Yes, he's asking us. I knew even then, I think, that he had only recently graduated.
Yeah.
So I can understand why he might.
Yes. Would you agree with this, that while a building services engineer like Max Fordham might recommend a U value target, that actually it was ultimately Studio E's responsibility as the architect and lead designer, with all the information that you had, to decide actually what U value was feasible and appropriate on the project?
I think we could have overruled something that was put forward by Max Fordham as the lead designer, yes.
Yeah.
I agree with that. We would have to have a good reason not to go with it.
Yes.
In other words, as you say, it would not be feasible. And in that case, yes, we would overrule it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you agree that when you were developing the design to the concept stage, that's RIBA stage C, you'd have had to have considered lots of aspects of the external wall design up to that point?
Yes.
And that would include the type of cladding to use. It would include the depth of the existing walls and the columns, and also the type and thicknesses of the insulation that would sit behind the rain screen. Do you agree that all those kind of factors will feed into the concept design stage?
I think the zone, particularly of the insulation, was the most critical. So
Yeah.
you've described the build-up, which is insulation, cavity, and cladding. The cladding is relatively nominal in terms of build-up, but
Yeah.
the insulation is significant, and on Grenfell Tower, the diamond columns were very significant because they abutted the windows.
Yeah.
So the thickening, offsetting of the cladding from the face of those columns potentially could impact on the windows
Yeah.
sizes. So
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is that particularly the outer rain screen element is very thin.
Relatively.
Then you have a cavity, but then you potentially have quite a thickness of insulation. So that's a key consideration when
Yes.
you're looking at that build-up. Is that
Yes.
correct? Yeah. Do you agree that Studio E would have to take into consideration a range of factors, including things like the client's budget, the client's overall requirements, the planning requirements, and any technical issues, such as buildability and regulatory compliance, when they were looking at that external wall build-up?
I'd say that's correct. That's the context we're working in.
Yeah. Would you agree that all that information would potentially feed into an assessment of what an appropriate U value should be for the project?
Yes.
And would you agree in that way, and I think you've confirmed it in your earlier answer that you said you could overrule if necessary on a U value. In that way, Studio E was ultimately responsible for coordinating the design strategy as a whole of the external wall?
We were responsible for coordination, yes.
Would you agree that in contrast, the building services engineer might not be aware of certain bits of information that would be relevant to that ultimate choice as to how you build up that wall?
It wouldn't be their interest, but we did discuss things, and they were aware of what would happen. They've experienced engineers. I think to say that they wouldn't know is maybe not correct.
But they might not be as familiar as you, for example, with the
Yes.
client's budget requirements and,
They wouldn't be as interested.
Yeah. Can we turn to some minutes from the design team meeting that was held on the 25th of June 2012. This is at SEA 404864. We can see that date at the top there, Monday the 25th of June, and we can see you're there and present as part of that list. And if we can go on to page 2 and look at the final paragraph under services. Yes, so it's at the bottom of that page. It's the final paragraph before acoustics. If we could just blow that up. And if we can just read that paragraph, it says MF, so that's max Fordham, yes?
Yes.
Indicate target U values for walls as 0.15 watts per metre squared Kelvin and 0.22 for windows, subsequently corrected to 1.6. And then it says limiting U values given in part L1B are 0.30 and 1.8 respectively. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So did you read this as Max Fordham saying target U values for the walls were 0.15, but the limiting U value given in part L was actually higher than that? It was 0.30. Is that how you read that at the time and understood that discussion?
I believe I clarified that after the meeting. I think there's an email where I clarified that.
When you say clarified that, what do you mean?
What-
Clarified that
what-
it was 0.15?
No, that it was 0.13. The limiting value was 0.3, sorry. And in other words, what the upper bound we needed to work to was.
What, that it wasn't that? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is at the meeting, the 0.15 figure was put forward,
Yeah.
and I, either at the meeting or after, sought clarification as to what the limit would be under Part L.
I see. And does that mean that the parts in brackets went in after the meeting?
Well, obviously, I
As a
wrote the
result of
minutes.
that.
I obviously wrote the minutes after the meeting, but
Yeah.
I can't recall when I clarified it
I
with
see.
Max Fordham.
Did you have any thoughts at the time about the appropriateness of that U value as a target figure? Did that say anything to you in terms of how ambitious that was, for example?
I think I used the word somewhere aspirational, or yes, it was quite low.
Yeah. Did you ever check approved document L during your time on the project to see what U value that guidance required for the thermal performance?
I don't recall doing so.
No, yeah. Were you aware that, as per this advice from Max Fordham, and the words in brackets, approved document L recommended that in circumstances where the entire wall at Grenfell was to be insulated, a U value of at least 0.30 watts per metre square Kelvin was to be adopted? That was the
I
guidance.
believe that's what that bracketed phrase
Yeah.
confirms.
So that means, doesn't it, that it's a more generous
Yes.
piece of guidance in approved document L, the 0.3. If it's higher, it's a less efficient
Correct.
thermal insulator.
The principle being under L1B is that it's a refurb, and therefore there are less expectation of meeting the current requirements.
Yeah, yeah,
So
Yeah.
Max Fordham were proposing the current requirements to bring the building up to current standards, whereas the guidance didn't require that.
no. And in fact, were you aware at the time that there was even more flexibility in the approved document L guidance, in that if it was not technically and functionally feasible to achieve the 0.3, then it just had to be upgraded to the best standard that's technically and functionally available? Did you know there was even more flexibility in those circumstances?
I can't remember specific knowledge of that.
Yeah.
No.
So I think we've established that in meeting the requirements of Part L, there is in fact considerable latitude in terms of the U value that's adopted, or that at the time there was considerable latitude in terms of the U value that could be adopted on this project.
To meet the requirements of Part L.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And were you aware when you were having these discussions about target U value? I mean, you've mentioned the 0.3 in the meeting, but in your mind, did you think to yourself, well, I know ultimately we've got some flexibility on this if that becomes necessary? Was that something that occurred to you?
Well, there it is, the 0.3.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
double. That
Let's just turn, we're going to keep going chronologically through the sequence of events. So now I'm going to turn to an email of the 5th of July that you sent to Rockwool. If we can pull this up. This is at SEA 404967. Yeah.
Can I just say that 0.3 is double 0.15 in terms of performance?
Yes.
It's in retrospect, it has occurred to me that Max Fordham were equally aware of the flexibility
Yes.
of that margin.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
And that it probably would have tolerated a change in insulation spec.
I see. Yeah.
And so I think they would have been aware of that at this time.
Yeah. Okay. I'm
That's
primarily
in
interested in
retrospect.
whether you had that awareness of the flexibility
I
available.
was aware of the flexibility. I wasn't aware that it would allow us a straight switch between a foam insulation and a mineral wool,
I see. Okay.
which I think it would.
So let's turn then to that email, SEA 404967. So this is an email that you sent on the 5th of July 2012 to tech.inquiries@rockwool.co.uk. Do you see that at the top?
Yeah.
And it's about the Grenfell Tower regeneration, the subject matter. And I think you've sent a couple of drawings. And you say, we're looking at overcladding an existing 1970s residential tower block in London. It's 24 stories. The services engineer have indicated a target U value for walls of 0.15. The existing building has precast concrete spandrels 250 millimetres thick. And then you go into some detail about the drawing. And then in the next paragraph, you say, please could you advise the appropriate insulation type and thickness for this application and to achieve the desired U value. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And then you've got a last comment about the roof area, which we don't need to look at. You seem to email a general inquiries email address within Rockwool at that point. Does that mean that you didn't have any specific contact yourself at Rockwool at that time, so that was the logical place to be asking?
Every company has their own approach. That email address is tech.inquiries. I think that I was aware of, or I phoned and discovered that they would like an email sent.
Yeah.
No, but if you're asking, as some companies might have individuals that area managers, that's not the way Rockwool tended to work, not for a U-value inquiry.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah. Okay. So we can see that you've sent off that email. Can we then look at another email on the 5th of July? This is SEA 404973. So this is you emailing Mr. McQuat and Mr. Smith and Mr. Watts at Max Fordham. And you attach something called Rockwool Duo Slab. And then you say you're disappointed in the first line that a meeting didn't happen today. Don't worry about that. Let's look at the last paragraph. You say there, we've sent off inquiries to Rockwool and Kingspan on the insulation and await their reply. The 0.15 U value you've asked for looks to me a bit aspirational. See attached, which suggests approximately 450 millimetre plus of insulation. Do you see that there? So I think that's the email you were prefacing earlier in your evidence, that where you say it looks a bit aspirational. And what you do is you have attached something to this email. It was a spreadsheet. I just want to turn to have a look at that. So this is a SEA 401334. And it appears to be an analysis, I think, of the thickness that would be required of the Rockwool to achieve the U value required. Can you remember, did you put that attachment together?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. You're slightly grimacing, Mr. Soames.
I'm not grimacing.
No, sorry. Do you want to say something about that before I ask you some questions about it?
Well, I'll explain what I was doing, and I never got a response to it, so I don't know if anyone looked at it. The figures, the orange background, are taken direct from what would have been the PDF brochure or of the Rockwool Duo Slab product. In other words, the thickness and the U value for that assembly, and I think the assembly included the wall and the lining. And it's clear it only went down to 0.2, which is short of the target. So I graphed it, and because although the insulation has the biggest impact on the U value, it's not a linear relationship as the graph demonstrates. So all I was trying to do is, well, if I extrapolated the line, where would that leave me?
Yeah,
roughly?
exactly.
So it was sort of an amateur detective.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So you effectively put the dotted line on
Yeah.
to try and work out, to get to 1.5, roughly what thickness would you end up with? And that was your analysis. That wasn't an analysis you'd got from somebody else.
I was aware that they published these figures and that the ratio was not linear.
Yeah. Just thinking back to the language that was used in that covering email, you say the U value you've asked for looks to me a bit aspirational. So you say the U value you've asked for to Max Fordham. Did Max Fordham actually ask for that U value? What do you mean by asked for?
At the meeting, they put forward a U value of 0.15. So ask, that was their proposal.
I see. In your witness statement at paragraph 43.7, if we can just turn that up, at SEA 30142273, page 20, yes, you say the level of insulation on the building was originally proposed by Max Fordham at the project meeting on the 25th of June 2012. They proposed a U value of 0.15 watts per metre square Kelvin. So we see that there. What I want to put to you is that at the time it was merely a suggestion rather than something they were actually requiring. It was a suggested recommendation by them. Is that how you interpreted it at the time? Or did you think that they were being more definite with you that it had to be that?
There was nothing, in a sense, mandatory about their request. I mean, it was aspirational, and aspirational for the sake of the project to maximise the thermal efficiency of the building.
Yeah.
I didn't see, it's clearly not required, but I've done a lot of work with Max Fordham, and this is very much a feature of their work and our work with them.
Yeah.
Had been to, I mean, aspirational doesn't mean irresponsible. It just means trying to do the best you can.
Yeah, I understand. Now,
Sorry, can I ask, did they ever say at that meeting what the basis of the 0.15 was? Or did they just...
I think I knew, or it was mentioned that was the current requirement for a new build. I think I was aware of that at the time.
Yes, thank you.
yeah. Now, Mr. Smith of Max Fordham responds the same day. Can we look at that email next? So this is SEA 404978. So you've sent him your analysis of the build-up, and you've said it looks a bit aspirational. And if we look at the first paragraph, he says in the second sentence, it would be good to discuss your proposed cladding window system at the same time. That's at a meeting. And then he says, those thicknesses of rock wool seem a bit high. Does that also include the thermal bridging from fastenings, frame, etc., and a ventilated cavity? For a glass fibre slab, excluding fastenings, etc., we'd expect to be able to achieve 0.15 U value with approximately 180 millimetres material only. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And then he goes on, a phenolic foam insulation would give greater insulation for the depth. Hopefully the response from Kingspan may be closer to target. And then he says something in the final paragraph about windows, which we don't need to worry about. So when you got this, do you agree that Mr. Smith of Max Fordham does seem to be questioning whether there really was a need for 450 millimetre depth of rock wool? He thinks that's a bit high.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you ever go back and clarify that with Max Fordham? And
That
say, well,
statement?
can we do something more precise to have a look at what the thicknesses would be?
No. No, I don't think there's any evidence that I did.
He's raising in his email the question of thermal bridging from fastenings and frame, etc. And he's saying that that could have a significant influence on the thickness of the product that would be needed. can you explain why he was saying that was relevant? Did you understand that at the time, why it might be relevant?
Yes, I think it reflects he didn't look at my email. The Rockwool figures would have accounted for the thermal bridging of the brackets.
Is the point that if you use thermally bridged brackets, that there's less heat transfer or heat loss through the bracketry, so they can help you keep your insulation narrower while still achieving the U value that you want? Is that the point?
No, I think in any calculation the brackets have to be factored as a thermal bridge, even with any thermal sort of neoprene thermal spacer. I think they still represent a bridge that would be factored into any calculation.
But did you think at this time about what he might be suggesting is that if you use thermally broken brackets, that thermal bridging can be improved?
I think standard thermally broken brackets were standard, I think.
I see, okay. So your analysis did think about that, did it?
I believe the Rockwool figures reflect that,
Okay.
because it showed a full build-up.
Yeah. Now, you got a response from Rockwool on the 24th of July 2012. If we can turn that up, this is at SEA 405276, and I want to look at the top of page 2. So we see this is from a Mr. Pritchard at Rockwool to you on that date, 24th of July 2012. And he says this: "Dear sir, please accept my sincere apologies for the delay in getting back to you. Further to your email, we would normally recommend the use of our rain screen duo slab for these types of construction. However, due to the low specified U value, the thickness needed would be exceptionally high, probably beyond the point of sensible building practice." And then he goes on and talks about the roof in the last paragraph. And just before I ask you some questions about this, can we scroll then up to the top of page 1? And what we see is that you then forward that email from Rockwool to Mr. Smith and Mr. McQuat at Max Fordham. And you say, "Andrew, Matt, I asked Rockwool about achieving 0.15 U values, and this is their response below. We have been working on a maximum of 250 millimetre build-up to the spandrel zones. The decision on the final system is pending, but assume a 50 millimetre panel vent zone, leaving you 200 millimetres for insulation. The geometry at the columns results in a reduced build-up of approximately 200 millimetres, or 150 millimetre insulation at high level, and then at low level, you then say what you're thinking about." And then you say this in the next paragraph: "Pushing the cladding line any further out will probably have buildability below and aesthetic issues." Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, just on that, can you explain how you arrived at the geometric specification of between 150 millimetres and 200 millimetres for the part of the cavity in which the insulation would sit? That's what you're saying in that email.
How we came up with those figures?
Yeah, how did you arrive at that? Can you remember?
I can't remember exactly how we came up with those figures, no.
Did you ever consider increasing the size of the cavity in order that a mineral wool insulation could be used within the cladding system?
I think based on that response from Rockwool, and if you do try and draw on what becomes more than half a metre of projection, it starts to become unfeasible. Just the projection of the brackets. I think the reason I believe the Rockwool were advising against it is the product itself is not that rigid, so it would require, I think, support of some sort.
Yeah.
So I think they recognise it as not being feasible for their product.
I see, yeah. In that third paragraph, that single sentence where you say pushing the cladding line any further out will probably have buildability below and aesthetic issues. Can you just explain exactly what you meant by buildability issues?
I'm referring to the comment from Rockwool that there wasn't a means short of putting a frame up to support the installation of that depth. That's the buildability. So as he says, it's not practical for that depth, for that product. Now here that's my interpretation of what he said.
Yeah, yeah. How could you be confident that there were any buildability issues if you hadn't confirmed that the 450 millimetre thickness of Rockwool would in fact be required to achieve the target U value of 0.15?
I'm sorry, how would I?
How could you be confident that there would be buildability issues if you hadn't actually confirmed that 450 millimetres of Rockwool would in fact be required to achieve the 0.15 U value?
Is that email from Rockwool confirm both the thickness and the...
Let's go back to the email from Rockwool, just so you've got it in front of you. SEA 405276 at page 2. So he says, further to your email, we would normally recommend the use of it. However, due to the low specified U value, the thickness needed would be exceptionally high. Do you agree that he doesn't actually give a thickness?
Quantify it, no.
So he's not said to you, it's going to be 450 millimetres. That was your extrapolation on that graph, I think. Do you agree what he's just saying is, in general terms, he thinks the thickness would be exceptionally high?
Yes, beyond the point of sensible building practice. I'm not obviously sure what he meant by that.
And what I'm asking is whether you ever got that definitively confirmed, whether got someone to do an analysis to check, would it in fact be 450 millimetres?
I didn't, but of course, I guess I might have... No, I didn't.
Okay, yeah. And you also, in your email, you said that there might be buildability issues and aesthetic issues with having that a greater thickness of mineral wool. What did you mean by aesthetic issues?
I wasn't sure how that was going to work around these diamond columns.
Yeah.
For instance, on the corners, it would look probably something we would want to avoid, I think.
I see, yeah.
So I saw that as, whether it was feasible, we didn't know. Well, we've just been told it's not feasible, but I think aesthetically it would have been undesirable.
Yeah, yeah. And is that because the columns are already a kind of a thickness out from the
I think it's
spandrels, so that the columns already stick out, the concrete columns. So if you're putting then a big thickness onto that, you were worried how it might look at the corners?
at the corners, yeah. I think the bigger issue is how that would have impact on the windows next to the columns.
But you wouldn't know exactly how it would play out in terms of aesthetic issues, would you, if you haven't done the precise calculation? You wouldn't have known exactly what it would be.
No, but 450 did sound excessive. I mean, it's half a metre once you've added the cavity.
Is it the case that following the exchange of these emails, Studio E gave up on the possibility of using Rockwool as an insulating material in the building?
It's implying we should have pursued it.
Well, let me put it more neutrally. Was there any thought given after these exchanges of emails, to using Rockwool? Were there any further investigations about that you did, or anyone else did?
I think after following this email and following which I think you'll come to, the one from Kingspan, I did pass on a glass wool product to Max Fordham. I think after that, I did not pursue any other alternatives because it would appear the thermal conductivity of the foam products, Rockwool or any other fibre couldn't compete with.
Yeah.
Did you think at all about simply abandoning the 0.15 target in favour of a more relaxed target?
As I said, we've done a lot of work with Max Fordham, and they pride themselves as an aspirational engineer, and we've gone with them. When I say gone with them, we've participated in numerous designs where they have done exceptionally sustainable buildings. And by and large, that sustainability is driven by passive measures. So we supported that. So where possible, we would, for instance, in our schoolwork, we would try and naturally ventilate the classrooms rather than mechanically ventilate. And so that this emphasis on passive sustainability was something that we shared with Max Fordham over a number of years. So without good reason, I at that point I couldn't see any reason to abandon the 0.15. It was in the project's interest to try and achieve it.
Right. Thank you.
Given that reliance on Max Fordham to provide specialist advice about the thermal performance, did you ever think about asking them to run the calculation as to precisely what thickness would be required of the rock wool?
I didn't think of it because I didn't.
Yeah, no.
No.
But do you agree that given the ambiguity in Mr. Smith's email, you could have actually confirmed what the thickness actually would be with Max Fordham? You could have actually asked them to run that calculation. You would have got a precise figure back from them.
They did eventually do one.
With the rock wool?
Not with the rock wool, no, but with the Celotex.
Yeah. But I'm just asking, they could have done that calculation for the rock wool if you'd asked them to, couldn't they?
I guess I was challenging them by that little exercise that I did.
Yeah.
But I didn't necessarily expect them to. I mean, I don't know what they thought of it, but they did.
Yeah.
They weren't prompted to disprove it.
Yeah. Can we just look at something in the inquiry's expert report, Mr. Hyatt's expert report? Can we go to PHYR 603 at page 19? Now, I don't know whether you've had a chance to consider this, but Mr. Hyatt has run the calculations to see what thickness of mineral wool could be achieved and what U value you would get. And his calculations are that with a mineral wool, it's possible for the spandrel condition to produce a 0.14 U value, so that's under the 1.5, against a 250 millimetre mineral wool insulation build-up. So it's perhaps thicker than you were envisaging in your email of 200, but it's 250. And for the column, it would be a 0.17. So this is a slightly worse U value than the 0.15 against a thickness of 180 millimetres mineral wool for the columns. Have you considered those before giving evidence?
I think our opening statement pointed you to the Rockwool website.
I beg your pardon, say that. Can you?
Studio E's opening statement, or perhaps it was the appendix, pointed you to the Rockwool website.
Right.
There's an online calculator,
Okay.
which came up with the same figure of 450 to achieve 0.15.
I see. So you're still saying you think it would be 450
I wouldn't. I wouldn't be so presumptive to think that my calculation is better or more accurate than these figures published by the manufacturer.
I see. Mr. Hyatt's calculations, just for completeness, appear at page 20 and 21, if we could just briefly look at those. So this is the calculation that he's done there for the columns, and it gives you the 0.17 there, and the 180 millimetre mineral will build up. And then I think over the page at 21, we get the 0.14 and the 250 millimetre mineral wool thickness for the spandrels. And both of those U values would be within the higher level of 0.30 that was in approved document L. Is it possible that the difference between Mr. Hyatt's calculations and the information which you were looking at the time via Rockwool is that, I'm going to put this to you again, that he has used thermally broken brackets which can make a difference in terms of the thermal efficiency and explain why a smaller thickness of insulation is required on his calculations? Is that possible, that might explain the difference?
I expect that Rockwool gave some thought to the figures that they published, and whether the figures seem excessive because haven't allowed for thermal breaks, maybe one factor. There may be others. That's obviously a question for them.
Yeah.
But in the first instance, in researching the insulation, I certainly gave greater priority to the figures that were published by the suppliers than a spreadsheet that I could have done myself.
I see, okay. Can we go on and look at another email? This is SEA 30143346. This is an email from Mr. Reck to you, dated the 25th of October 2013. So this was later in time than the exchanges we've just looked at. And it's an email, the subject is BREEAM. Do you see that there? Is it right that BREEAM means the BRE, Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Method? Yes. Is that right?
Yes.
And is it right that that's an established method of assessing, rating and certifying the sustainability of buildings?
Yes.
And Mr. Reck attaches his potential scoring assessment comments against BREEAM. And then if we go to page 2, under the heading Mat 1, Environmental Impact of Materials, he talks about some assumptions about what's been achieved. And then there's this comment that I just want to ask you about. It's in black, as distinct from the blue text. He says, it also seems MF, Max Fordham, went for OTT U values to achieve maximum credits available for thermal performance criteria, which come to force if Green Guide rating credits do not manage to achieve the top 25 credits available. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask you about what you understood to be the phrase OTT U values. Is that, do you think he's saying over the top U values?
Well, I did follow his evidence, yes, I believe he confirmed that.
Did you ever discuss at the time with Mr. Reck that he thought the Max Fordham U values were over the top?
I must be honest, the whole subject of BREEAM wasn't one that I was much involved during the project.
Forget BREEAM for a moment. At any time during the project, did you have a discussion with Mr. Reck about Max Fordham's U value, and in particular the 0.15 for the external wall, and whether that was over the top? Do you remember ever discussing that with him?
Over the top, it's got a sort of pejorative sense, which I do not recall.
No.
No.
So you don't recall having a discussion in those terms? No. Do you recall having any discussion with him about how ambitious that U value target was?
it wasn't ambitious. It was what the standard was for a new build. It wasn't super insulated. It was trying to match a new build.
I see. Did you ever go back to Max Fordham and discuss the possibility of increasing the U value at any stage on the project?
No.
Yeah. And can you help us as to why that discussion didn't happen? Why you never went back to them and discussed increasing it?
Well, with hindsight, obviously, no one challenged the insulation.
Yeah. Now, if we can bring up, so I'm picking back the chronology back up in July 2012 now, okay? And I want to look at SEA 404986. And we can see that on that date, you emailed Mr. Smith of Max Fordham, copying in a number of others, including at Max Fordham. And you say, Matt, Kingspan have come back with 200mm phenolic to achieve 0.15 U value, see attached. And then you say, I've attached a data sheet for glass fibre product. I'm rusty on calculations, but I interpret this product as having twice the thermal conductivity of phenolic and therefore needing twice the thickness. Do you see that? And again, I think you anticipated we'd come to this earlier in your evidence. Can we just have a look at the glass fibre insulation product data sheet that you attached to this email? We can look at that at SEA 401337. So this is headed Superglass, April 2012, cladding mat 37. And we see in the smaller text just underneath that heading, it says cladding mat 37 is a resilient mineral wool insulation mat with a high tensile strength for use in the walls and roofs of profiled metal clad buildings. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
So it also appears to be a form of mineral wool insulation. And if we look in the bottom of page 1, in that little green bubble, yes, thank you, we can see from the first bullet, it's saying fire performance, fire classification A1 non-combustible. Now, you said in your covering email that you were rusty on calculations. Did you ever think to check your calculations in respect of the Rockwool product with Max Fordham or with Rockwool themselves?
Isn't that just a repeat of your earlier question?
It is, but it was with specific reference to you having said in that email that you were rusty on calculations.
Well, I was comparing the K value there, 0.037, with the Kingspan. Because
Yeah.
I knew that the insulation has the biggest impact on the U value. So you could just look at those figures and
Yeah.
see roughly where they sit next to each other.
When you were looking at this product, did you note the fire performance of this product?
No,
That wasn't something you looked at.
no.
And I think you said earlier, back in March, that you wouldn't have understood what the A1 meant. Is that right? The European classification method?
What it actually specifically means, no. I can't say I know now, but non-combustible means non-combustible.
Yeah. Now, if we can turn to SEA 405818. This is an email of the 15th of August 2012. And I want to pick up on what you say. So this is to Mr. McQuat of Max Fordham, and it's about the external wall and BREEAM. And I want to pick up in the last paragraph. You say, we need to discuss U value insulation spec. I found a U value calculator here, and you give the link for that, and made a stab at insulation thickness to achieve the 0.15 U value. Attached is from the website. I'm not sure how to make allowances for the brackets. Remember, we have an issue with the insulation around the columns, and I don't want you advertising something we A, aren't showing, and B, we can't achieve, can we discuss? Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, can you recall what those calculations showed in terms of the thickness of insulation that was needed?
No. Sorry, I haven't revisited this.
You say there, I'm not sure how to make allowances for the brackets. Could that be not sure how to make allowances for thermally broken brackets that we were discussing earlier?
No, for the thermal bridging that the brackets represent.
I see.
You have to allow that a certain amount of heat's going to find its way through the brackets.
And you weren't sure how to do that calculation, is that right?
Using that online calculator.
Yeah, I see. Now, Mr. McQuat of Max Fordham replies to this on the 16th of August, the following day. Can we go to that SEA 405840? And he says this, Bruce, I've done the following calculations to work out how much insulation that we would need to achieve 0.15 overall. The Celotex FR5000 is a solid PIR board, data sheet attached. I think this is the only type of product that will give us the required performance. Kingspan also a version of this. And then he says, can you comment on the spandrel panel, etc. So he provides at this point the data sheet, the product data sheet for the Celotex FR5000 product. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, did you know what PIR board was referring to in that second line? He says it's FR5000 is a solid PIR board. Did you know what PIR was?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I knew what it stood for, polyisocyanurate.
Yeah.
And I think I mentioned previously that I had been aware of it for some time.
And what was your reaction when you received this email about the suitability of the Celotex FR5000 product for use in the overcladding system?
I can't recall.
Did you have any concerns about the reference to PIR board in this email? Did that ring any alarm bells for you?
No. No, I think going back, PIR and phenolic had become all but standard in every project this time.
When you say standard for every project, can you be clear what you mean? Every project you'd worked on?
Every project that I had worked on, there were exceptions, but invariably some form of foam board was used in the facades and on the roof.
I think we clarified at the very beginning of your evidence you hadn't done a residential overcladding above 18 metres before, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So these other projects were low-rise projects.
5 stories.
Is that right? Yeah. Now, I just want to pick up at this point something that you've said in your witness statement. If we can look at that at this point. This is SEA 30144273 at page 55. And I want to look at the very last sentence at the top of that page on 116.2. This is where you're discussing the Celotex FR5000. And you say this, none of Max Fordham, CEP, Exova, or any other specialist I had discussed the project with had raised this as a technical design issue. And I think you mean this as in its fire performance. Is that right?
It's Class O fire performance.
Yeah. So you're saying none of those bodies on the project had raised the Celotex FR5000 being a technical, and its Class 0 fire performance as a technical design issue. That's what you're saying?
Yes.
Is it your evidence that because neither Max Fordham nor CEP nor indeed Exova ever raised the question of compliance of FR5000 with you, that Studio E had no reason to think that it was non-compliant with the building regulations or the guidance in ADB?
Is that the only reason? I can't believe it's the only reason. I think these types of products were widely used.
Yeah.
Can you just help me with this? You, you say that these foam boards had become quite common on projects that you dealt with.
There had been a distinct, with the tightening of the Part L requirements, over 5, 10 years.
Yeah.
The
What I'm really interested in now is this. You obviously knew about those boards from what you've told us, and I suspect you knew that they were quite efficient. Your first instinct, on the other hand, was to reach for the rock wool.
Yes.
Why was that?
It's the safest. There was a time when BREEAM assessments would only give a Class A, would only give rockwool Category A status, so your maximum points could only be achieved with rockwool. When I started as a young architect, that's all we used. So, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Can I just be completely clear? When you say it's the safest, do you mean the safest in terms of fire performance or the safest in terms of its thermal performance?
But no, I'd say safest in terms of fire, but also in terms of its sustainability in a broader sense, the embodied carbon, recyclability. It was always regarded as the safest choice.
Yeah. Did you have any awareness, once the rock wool fell out of the picture, that what you were looking at with other products was less safe from a fire performance point of view? Did you have any awareness of that at the time?
I'd have to agree that you can't put them side by side and say the mineral wool isn't less likely to burn. Obviously, it's not going to burn. But at the time, I was of the view, which I think I've said, that the Celotex didn't burn; it just charred. In other words, the whole history of polyurethanes had been solved, and it was safe to use in cavities.
Yeah.
That was my understanding at the time.
Yeah. Did there ever come a time when you asked Max Fordham, before the NBS specification was prepared, whether the use of FR 5000 was compliant with the building regulations and the guidance in approved document B? Were they ever asked that question?
No.
Now, we looked in detail in your evidence last time at the advice and the written advice produced by Exova. Is it right that there was never any written advice from Exova about the suitability of FR 5000 before the NBS specification was prepared?
No.
Or any verbal advice from Exova? Did you ever discuss the suitability of FR 5000 before you put the NBS together?
I personally did not, no.
Did it ever occur to you that it might be a good idea to ask Exova to comment specifically on the suitability of using the Celotex FR 5000 product?
No, it didn't. And just why I say personally it never occurred to me is Adrian, Jess and Thomas Reck had independent conversations with Exova. So I don't personally know of any discussions with Exova I'm not aware that they had any conversations with Exova, and I'm aware that I didn't have any conversations with Exova. We did not, I know you're coming to this, but we did not put forward proposals to Exova because we, as I saw it, didn't have a firm scheme for them to assess.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it was one form of board or another, I knew that it's just a board. It's just a zone at stages C and D.
Okay. Turning to CEP and thinking about them for a moment, did you ever specifically raise the proposed use of FR 5000 with them?
I don't recall.
Now, Turning then to your witness statement, can we go on, this is SEA 30144273 at page 114, and I want to look at paragraph 270. And you say here, I got in touch with Harley on the 11th of September 2013, and we arranged to meet on the 27th of September 2013. We arranged to meet near London Bridge Station, and the meeting took place at a coffee shop in Hayes Galleria. And you say it was Ray Bailey, Mark Harris, both Harley, Thomas Reck, Studio E, and me. And then you say before the meeting, Thomas Reck emailed Mark draft elevations, details, wind load calculations, and U-value targets. Now, I'm going to come back to ask you about this Hayes Galleria meeting when we're talking about the aluminium composite panels, because we're going to look at that in detail in a moment. But I just want to focus for a minute on the insulation. You then say at paragraph 271, just below that in your statement, if we can read it out, you say, I was of the understanding that PIR products were generally safe to use in cavities. This was based on my general awareness that it had been widely used in the construction industry in the last 20 years, during which time I had not heard it constituted a fire hazard. My understanding was that it would only char when subjected to a flame, and it had also been marketed with certification from the Loss Prevention Certification Board as part of steel composite panels, which are very widely used. When I met Harley, I believe I had a lingering uncertainty about PIR because this was a high-rise, and I had not been involved in a high-rise before. I believe, but I cannot say for sure, that I asked Ray Bailey a question about the acceptability of using rigid foam insulation on a high-rise building, probably at the end of the meeting. If I did, I don't recall he provided a definitive response. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, you've set out your understanding about PIR products at the beginning of that paragraph and what your general awareness was. Was that your understanding at the time you met Harley on the 27th of September 2013?
Yes.
Yeah. And where you say that you thought they were generally safe to use, was that your expectation was that that would also be in high-rise buildings as well prior to that meeting?
Given that it had been put forward by Max Ford, and that had been my understanding, but I believe I did ask the question.
Where did your understanding come from that PIR products only char when subjected to a flame? What was that based on?
I'm having déjà vu. I remember in my previous practice, would have been 98, 99, the Celotex representative visiting and presenting their product. And part of that presentation, I mean, I say it wasn't a CPD, it was a around the table discussion which covered the polyurethane fires. And I have looked it up. I believe he did refer to the Sun Valley fire, where it was prior to the reduction in use of polyurethanes, they represented a hazard because they could burn within cavities, they could smoulder long distances. And the message and the understanding that I had over 20 years was polyurethane doesn't do that. Sorry, polyisocyanates doesn't do that. If you check Wikipedia, There's a video which gives you an illustration of what I understood.
Okay. Yeah. You then go on and you're talking about how you believe a lingering uncertainty about PIR because it was a high-rise. Was the lingering uncertainty in relation to fire safety or some other lingering uncertainty?
No, it would have been its fire.
It would have been its fire. Do you have any recollection of discussing insulation with Mr. Bailey of Harley at that meeting? Can you actually recall discussing the insulation as distinct from the rain screen panels?
I believe I asked him about the acceptability of using a rigid foam, and I might not have mentioned it as Celotex. We did discuss insulation in the round because we discussed the assembly of the facade, the sequence, how it would all be supported. So in a general sense, we did discuss insulation. On reflection, I believe one of the reasons I might have been prompted to ask, not just any kind of lingering uncertainty, but I think we were shown several pictures of the Ferrier Point Tower under construction. And those in progress construction, you could quite clearly see where the insulation was mineral wool.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's in hindsight. Those pictures have been disclosed by the inquiry, but we didn't receive digital copies until 6 months later, I believe.
Do you know now exactly which pictures you're referring to?
Do you want me to?
Have you got a ref?
I've got a reference. 00003497.
Is that a Studio E document?
Sorry, SEA. Yes.
Yeah, SEA. Okay. Let's just. I'll take you to that in a moment. Can I just pick up on something you said? You said you asked him about the acceptability of using rigid foam insulation on a high-rise building. What did you mean by acceptability?
I think it probably is a regulatory question as to whether the regulations would accept it.
From recollection, would Mr. Bailey have understood it? Oh, sorry, I can't ask you that. But is that how you meant him to understand what you were asking him? Were you clear that he'd understood you were asking about the compliance with the building regulations? Or is it possible, I mean, can you actually remember using the word acceptability?
No, I can't remember what words I used. Is it okay? Yeah, I can't. I mean, I'd speculate. I cannot recall.
When you say, is it okay, is that you saying what you might have said to him?
I might have said that, but I can't remember. The reason why it wasn't minuted, in my mind, I didn't think it was a key issue. I did a set of notes from this meeting, and I didn't minute this. I didn't think it was something I needed to report back on. And I don't even think I necessarily asked it while we were sitting down. I think I might have said it after we'd stood up. It was an afterthought.
And is your best recollection now that you might have said, is it okay?
That's a bit of guessing, but that might have been what I said.
So does it remain that your evidence that you believe, but you can't say for sure, that you raised a question with Mr. Bailey at the end of the meeting?
I can't say for sure, but I believe I did.
Okay. Do you have any recollection of discussing fire safety any more generally at this meeting with the Harley representatives?
I'm trying to think if there was anything that may have had a bearing, but I can't think of anything. No.
If you were going to ask Mr. Bailey a question because you were concerned about compliance, would you agree that you'd probably have asked, is PIR safe to use on a high-rise building? You'd have put the question that way.
If I had any serious concern, I would have asked that first.
Yeah.
As I said, it was an afterthought. It wasn't a serious concern.
And are we to understand that the reason it was an afterthought is because of exactly what you said in the beginning of this paragraph, that your general understanding was that it was safe to use?
Yes.
because of what you'd understood before this?
Yes. And I think I was aware that it was used on high rises. I can't point or anything firm, but you see the buildings going up.
Yeah,
Insulation's sometimes exposed, and you do see it.
I see. Did you ever raise that lingering uncertainty with Exover, the fire safety specialist, at any time?
Well, no. If it was a genuine concern, I would have raised it directly.
But you didn't ever do that?
No. In this context, I think it was because of all the mineral wool that was used on Ferrier Point. I think I was prompted just to mention it, because that was one of the differences between Ferrier Point and Grenfell was the insulation.
And did it ever occur to you that it might be sensible to get written advice from Exover addressing this specifically and the compliance of using a PII product?
Exover were appointed to provide a fire strategy. At this stage, and even thereafter, I did not look at them as being necessarily providing detailed checking of specification. I mean, that doesn't feature in their outline fire strategy. That's not the focus of their work.
Yeah. At this point, I promised you I'd take you to the document that you've just referred me to. Let's do that now. This is SEA 403497. So is what you're saying that this is one of the images that you were shown at that meeting?
I can't be sure I was shown that image, but I believe that there were a handful of which the inquiry has,
Okay.
showing the construction of the tower with the panels half on.
Yeah. And that was at that Hayes Galleria meeting?
Yes,
You're sure about that?
pretty sure.
I've asked you about Exover. Did you ever go back and seek a definitive response from elsewhere, for example, from Max Fordham, about the acceptability of using the PIR on a high rise?
No, because that wouldn't really fall to them.
What about with building control? Do you have any recollection of ever asking building control whether they were content for a PIR insulation to be used on a high rise?
I'm not aware. I do not recall.
Does that mean you can't remember, or you can't recall having that specific discussion with building control?
Same thing. I don't recall any conversations on the subject myself.
With building control?
The conversations with building control, as was covered in all of Exover's testimony, really did focus on the inside,
Yeah.
and particularly the smoke and the escapes.
Now, as you've mentioned, you've said candidly that there is no written record of you querying the PIR insulation with Harley and Ray Bailey at this meeting. Mr. Bailey doesn't refer to any such question having been posed to him in his statement, albeit we'll in due course be able to ask him about this. But I want to put it to you, is it not more likely that you actually didn't raise this issue at all with Harley, given you had this confidence in the use of PIR?
No, I think if you look at that secret, I mean, I asked Thomas Reck if he remembered anything. He couldn't remember anything. So I don't expect Ray Bailey to remember it. But if you look at all the pictures together, I think, yeah, you might ask the question.
Because what you're saying is all the pictures together definitely clearly showed some insulation as well as
lots
the...
of mineral wool, yeah.
Yeah. showed lots of mineral wool specifically.
These pictures show a tower which is a similar height to Grenfell, and it's all mineral wool.
Are you saying that that's what mineral wool that we can actually see there now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, that yellow, so the yellow substance.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you can tell immediately what that is.
So you can tell from looking at that that's mineral wool,
Yes.
as distinct from a PIR board.
Which has got the silvered
Because it's not got the foil with the product
yes.
logo on the outside. Yes, I see. Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I think that would be a good moment for a break.
Yes, all right.
If that's okay.
Yeah, well, we're going to have a break now, Mr. Sounes. We take slightly longer breaks than we did in the past to give other people the chance to feed questions into council. So we're going to break now until 25 to 12, and you can go and stretch your legs, maybe get a cup of coffee. But please remember not to talk to anyone else about your evidence or anything to do with Studio E's involvement in this matter. All right, while you're out of the room. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to go to the usher. Right, 25 to 12, please.
Thank you.
Okay.